I'm James Lane, and a few years ago when I bought this 1962 Bel Air Wagon project, I knew I had my work cut out for me. This car had a lot of rust in the rockers and the floor pan areas, which I repaired by adding new metal, mostly by way of a one-piece floor pan section. So if you had seen my previous videos, you saw where I top coated and undercoated that new floor pan section that I installed, and now it's time to move on to another task, which is the firewall. So even though the outside of the car is going to be left to show its age, I do want this thing to look good when you open up the hood. And this is one of those fine details that'll make that happen. So now that I've got the hood off, I'm going to concentrate on this firewall. I'm going to strip all these components off so we can get ready to prep this thing for paint. Well, the firewall is pretty much stripped down, as you can see, and I do still have a few items that I need to remove, like the steering column. I could just tape it up, but I've got a brand new gasket and I need to replace that, so that's going to involve me taking the steering column out of the car. And up here in the cowl area, you can see all this trash. I'm going to need to vacuum all that out because you don't want to be spraying paint. That stuff will blow all over the place. I believe we're about ready to start prepping some of these rust areas, sanding them down, treating them, and getting some primer on there. Now, if you see these areas here, you notice that I didn't take the heater core out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back tape these holes, all these firewall holes, of course, before I start spraying any paint. But eventually, all of this is going to be removed. I'm going to leave it in there for the time being, just to kind of keep the elements out. But I'm going to be adding vintage AC to this car, and that basically eliminates this hole and this hole here. You've got a whole different heater AC box that goes in there that replaces the factory one. But like I said, we're going to leave that in there for the time being. So let's get to cleaning up and starting to prep work on this firewall. Well, I got about half of this knocked down, as you can see, and when I got over here I caught an edge and I took a casualty. My grinder hit the ground and split in half, so now I'm gonna have to go get a new grinder. So everything looks pretty good right now. I do have a few issues up here on the cowl, a few areas I need to address, a few little pinholes, which is pretty common on something this old. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna spot blast these areas along these seams that I can't get into. And what I'm going to use is this setup down here. So as you can see, I got my tarp laid out, I've got my blast media, and I've got this gun here. Now this gun actually come out of my blasting cabinet. And what I do is I'll put the siphon tube right here down into the media, hook up my air, and then go to town spot blasting. And it works pretty good. I've done it on several different projects, and it's really good for little small areas like these seams here. Well, it was going so good that I just couldn't stop. So instead of just doing them seams, I just decided to do the whole firewall and just get it taken care of. It looks pretty good. Now you're not going to be able to get it like super perfect unless you just want to keep going and keep going and keep going over it. And what I'm using is cold slag. And as you can see, this stuff's pretty messy. You don't want to do this indoors. You'll just have this stuff everywhere. Now I've got my tarp down here. Now what I can do is I can reclaim all this stuff and put it through a sifter, put it back in my bag and reuse it. So this is going to be a lot better than trying to hand sand this thing. Now, we are going to put epoxy primer on here. We're going to put a high build primer, and then we're going to sand that down smooth, and then we're going to put down our base coat and our clear coat. And of course, I am going to re-seam seal some of these areas. I've tried to dig most of it out. A lot of it fell out, you know, just over the years. So I think this is going to turn out pretty good, and I'm losing daylight, so I'm going to have to come back tomorrow and put this thing in primer. So I'm in the tape up step of the prep work now, and as you can see, I've got most of my holes taped off on my firewall. Now, it's pretty important that you do this so you don't get any kind of overspray on the inside of the car. So with the firewall done, I need to continue taping up. I need to do across the windshield, across the bottom right there where the floor pan meets, and down the sides of the car. Well, she's finally all taped up, and the only thing I need to do before I spray it is wipe this thing down with wax and grease remover. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spray all this with epoxy primer, and then I'm going to come back in these areas after it flashes off and apply my seam sealer to these areas here where I'm pointing to. And then on top of that, I'm going to come back with a 2K high build primer, and what that'll do is that'll give us a sandable primer that we can sand down and make all this nice and smooth. These are the primers that I'm going to be using on the firewall. Over here on the left, this is Shopline epoxy primer, just like we used on the top side and the bottom side of the floor, except this is white in color. And over here on the right, this is 2K urethane primer, and we're going to use that on top of the epoxy primer. Now, I've got the epoxy primer mixed up. Now, it mixes 2 to 1, and it has a 15-minute induction time, which means you mix it together and you let it sit for 15 minutes before you even start spraying. So once this gets ready, I'm going to pour it in the gun and we're going to go to shooting. Now this epoxy primer turned out really good, and now that it's flashed off, I'm going to take this SEM black seam sealer and I'm going to go over these areas where I need to seam seal before I put down the 2K primer. So I'm ready to spray the 2K primer, and I'm only going to spray the face area here of the firewall. Now, those are really the only areas that I need to kind of slicken up, areas that you're going to see. This epoxy primer, like the other epoxy primer that I sprayed on the floor, it has a 72-hour top coat window, so I should be able to spray this 2K today, come back, sand it tomorrow, top coat with base coat and clear coat tomorrow. So there you have it, the high build 2K primer is on, and we're going to let this dry overnight, and then we're going to come back tomorrow morning and we're going to start sanding this down and getting it ready for the base coat and the clear coat. So it's the next day and the primer is ready to be sanded before we get the base coat and the clear coat on. Now if you look real carefully, you can see I've already added some guide coat, and the guide coat that I used is SEM Guide Coat Black. Now, a lot of guys don't want to use guide coat. I like to use it because this really shows you exactly what you've done, and it'll help you from blowing through the primer with the sandpaper, and that's pretty important because you don't want to sand through the bare metal. most of the main areas are sanded down, as you can see, but I do still have these hard to reach areas. And to hit these areas here, I'm going to use this gray Scotch-Brite, and that'll help me get into all these little nooks and crannies. Now, you don't have to be perfect with this because most of this stuff's not going to be seen. Your fenders bolt on here, so from here over you won't see. Same thing on this side from here over. And then you're going to have an engine right here in the middle. You're going to have your frame, and you're going to basically be looking down on all this. So most of the stuff you're going to see is pretty much up top here. You're going to have a plate over this. Your wiper motor goes in here. So just really some of these areas are the only ones that you need to really concentrate on. You don't have to make it perfect. The firewall is all wiped down, and the next step is to spray some base coat. Here is the base color that I'm going to use. Now this is Shopline brand, like all the other stuff that you've been seeing me use, and this is Ermine White, the factory color. The gun that I use to spray primer and sometimes base coat is this Harbor Freight gun. Now these things out of the box are not really that good, but there are ways to make it pretty good. You just got to disassemble it and clean it. I might just do a video on that at some point. But for today, the base coat and the clear, I'm breaking out my big gun. Now this is a DeVilbiss gun. It's a pretty expensive gun. I use this mostly for base coat, clear coat, higher end paint jobs, you know, overall outside jobs, stuff like that. That's what I use this for. Usually something like this Firewall, I would just use my Harbor Freight gun, but today I decided I'm going to use the good one. Now before you start spraying this base coat, you know, you want to wipe it down with wax and grease remover, which I've already done. And you're going to take something like this right here. Now this is a tack rag, and you're going to go over this entire panel, and this is going to get any of the final dust, dirt, and anything out that may be still trapped on the surface. The base coat is on, and it's time to lay down the clear coat. Now here's the clear coat that I'm going to be using. This is a high solids clear coat made by PPG. This is Value Pro. I've had a lot of good experience with this stuff. It lays out really good, and it's going to make this firewall look nice and slick. Now this step of spraying clear is my favorite part because that means I'm almost done. Well, it's finally all sprayed. It's finally done, and I'm really happy with the way this thing's turned out. It's really super glossy, as you can see, and it looks 1,000 times better than what we had before. You know, we had a lot of pitting and some surface rust all over this thing, and now it's nice and smooth and slick. So as always, thanks for watching. Be sure to check out my other videos on my other projects. And if you're not subscribed, make sure you click that subscribe button, click the bell so you'll get the notifications. And you can also follow me on Facebook and Instagram.